the room. I'll click got it. Got it. Okay. Yes, thank you so much for the invite, Laura. It's so great to be here. And thanks for the tech setup. It's very multifaceted and it's working well so far. So I am Lindsay McNiff. I'm the Learning and Instruction Librarian, as Laura mentioned, and we've got a session for you today on information literacy and biology. And I will start with an outline of what we'll be talking about. So I'm going to give, I'm not a science librarian. As Laura mentioned, I am the liaison for the information science program, but that's not quite science as we understand it here. So I'm going to give some background on information literacy as a concept and kind of how it's evolved in higher education, where the discussions are, some big information literacy questions for students, just to kind of convince you that this really is a spicy topic, as Sarah mentioned. I'll turn it over to Nicole because she's going to talk specifically about information literacy through the STEM lens. And we'll talk a bit about information literacy in your classes, some of the options. Nicole also has from the literature a few examples that pertain specifically to biology classrooms and what that looks like. And then we'll have some discussion. Okay, so what is information literacy? I'll start with what's actually a non-definition, but it's probably my favorite definition of information literacy, which is from Kushla-Kapitsky, who said in 2003, the meaning of information literacy since 1974 has never been monolithic or fixed. So information literacy is very, very contextual. So how people interact with information, what their needs around that information are, always tends to be very bounded to a specific context. So if we try to come up with a universal definition of information literacy, it's always going to be with kind of one particular learner, one particular person in mind that is just not ever going to be universal. So we don't need or want a universal definition. 1974, why that specific date? Because that was actually when, or that this is kind of broadly recognized as being its first appearance in the literature, at least as far as the library and information studies world is concerned. And it actually emerged not in an educational context. So we often think of information literacy as something that we view through an educational lens, but it actually emerged in the industry sector. So Paul Zurkowski, who at the time was the president of the Information Industry Association, defined it as people trained in the application of information resources to their work. It can be called information literates. So this was during a time when information was proliferating. There were concerns about how to evaluate it. And it was seen that if you're going to be successful in the information economy, you're going to have to become information literate. So it's interesting to think about that as having emerged through sort of a productivity kind of context, very labor and work based. And that's really not how we see it now, but it is kind of the darker origins of it, I guess you would say. So a few definitions, more current definitions of information literacy. I'll start with the definition from the Association of College and Research Libraries. So this is, it's an American association, but it's broadly sort of North American focused. And their definition of it is a set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So this is kind of the definition that's currently embraced by a lot of North American higher education institutions, specifically libraries. Then the other one I want to offer is from the UK, from the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals. So this is interested more broadly in libraries as a whole, as opposed to academia and academic libraries. And part of that definition reads, the ability to think critically and make balanced judgments about any information we find and use. It empowers us as citizens to reach and express informed views and to engage fully in society. So I like these two definitions in concert with each other, because with the ACRL definition, we can think about things like, the finding of information, the use of it, how we participate in community. And then over to the other definition from the UK, we're thinking about things like, what does that actually look like in practice? What does that allow us to do? It allows us to make judgments. It allows us to be informed citizens and participate fully in the world. So, and as I mentioned, these are information literacy definitions created out of a particular context. Going back to 2000, the ACRL, so those folks responsible for that first definition, actually came up with a set of standards for measuring information literacy. So thinking about what does the information literate learner look like? What are they able to do? And they came up with 5 standards, which were actually very widely adopted and used across North American institutions. And they allowed for sort of benchmarking and comparison between institutions. So these standards were things like information literate learner can determine the extent of their need. They can access the information. They can evaluate it. They can use it effectively for a specific goal. And then they also have a sense of the economic and legal and social issues surrounding use of information. So those standards were, as I mentioned, widely adopted, widely used. However, they were created in a time that was pre sort of a big shift in the internet, as you can imagine, and before students were really sort of creators of information within the information world. And so, as with any standards, of course, they face criticisms and critiques. And over time, those critiques and criticisms became louder and louder because it didn't seem like this really reflected the world that we live in now. So in around 2013 is when this began, but it was formalized and fully adopted in 2015, emerged the framework for information literacy in higher education. And this fully replaced the standards. So the framework is a completely different take on information literacy, rather than having sort of these linear step-by-step ticky boxes. You know, students can demonstrate that they're information literate in this way. They instead introduced 6 core concepts that are interrelated. They're not linear. So whereas in the former standards, we begin with the easy stuff, determining the extent of the need. We move on to accessing. So it kind of moves in a almost like scaffolded fashion. Whereas with the framework, we're looking at core concepts that are interrelated. None sort of is expected to appear, or students are not expected to be good at one before they can learn another. And instead of having things like learning outcomes and the other one, performance indicators, like in the previous set of standards, there are instead knowledge practices and dispositions. So knowledge practices being how somebody demonstrates that they have grasped a particular concept, and then disposition being almost like the attitudinal or habit of mind associated with that. So these are the 6 core concepts. I'm going to take a drink of water. And Laura, I don't know if you know this yet, but Nicole and I are very excited to share that there's actually a STEM-specific version of this.
Oh.
Yes, which is new to me. And Nicole, sorry, I'm not sure how you came across it, but you can speak more to it when you're up. But there has been a sort of interpretation of this through the STEM lens, which Nicole is going to talk about specifically. But I do just want to kind of whip through these really quick and say about maybe one sentence related to each, just to give you a sense of what each of these mean. So authority is constructed and contextual, the idea that authority emerged and is recognized specifically within a community, and what that community looks like and what their practices are will vary. Information creation as a process, the idea that we really need to look at what goes into creating a piece of information in order to understand its value and its use in a particular context. Information has value is about the commodification of information, including one's own information, and what that looks like in the context of things like paywalls, where one person has access to information that another person may not. Research is inquiry, the idea that research is about asking increasingly complex questions, partly about filling in gaps, and that you may actually embark on a research project where the answer is not immediately apparent. Scholarship is a conversation, the idea that research does not emerge in a vacuum, so there's always arguments being given different weights, and things are emerging from other previous projects, and work is in conversation with each other rather than emerging in a vacuum. And then finally, searching a strategic exploration. So this is about searching widely and deeply, having different strategies to find information rather than kind of relying on the same tried and true approaches. So that's your brief introduction to the framework, and Nicole's going to get into the science angle of it in just a moment. But I wanted to share with you as well just the work of Project Information Literacy, which is a nonprofit out of the US. And they've been doing work since 2008, looking at the student experience through the lens of information. So they're mainly academia focused. I think they have one project that looks at high school students as well. But a few of their key findings, and in the references for this presentation, there's a kind of recent, not final report of their work, but an overview of some of the studies that's really useful. So a few things that they found over these studies, and there's several of them, is that student research is driven by familiarity and habit. So most students are using their tried and true sources. They're using Wikipedia, they're using Google, and they're consulting with friends. They like to do that as well. They found that students are excited about academic research, but overwhelmed by it. So the process of sorting the wheat from the chaff, I guess, and the prospect of having to use academic databases, the prospect of having to use an academic library. So that is overwhelming for them, and they did notice a gap between their high school preparation and the demands of academia. There was an interesting study where I believe the number was 84. Yeah, 84% of their students in the study, and their studies tend to be large as well, found that getting started was actually the most difficult aspect of research. So finding a topic and a course of research. And what they found through interviews in this study is that students are just not really, a lot of them are not in the position to form inquiry in research. So they're not in that frame of mind yet. Students appreciate discussions of how to evaluate sources. So they have looked at source evaluation practices, and students are evaluating sources. They're not taking things at face value necessarily, but they use a wide variety of practices to do that, and would appreciate being able to share with peers and also hear from instructors on the practices they use to evaluate sources. They found that this is interesting. They looked at research assignments and found that very few of them provide any kind of guidance about how to do research. So there's, it needs to be this, the assignment needs to be this long, you need to use this many sources. So it's very instructive in that sense, but no kind of guidance on how to do research. So it's just kind of expected that students know what to do, and there's no guidance in the assignment. So interesting. A few kind of big, as I mentioned, the spicy questions, I guess, to think about before I turn it over to Nicole are things like the question of information privilege and paywalls. So students might be interested in thinking about things like open access and open science, and also questioning, is a person able to do proper research if they're facing a paywall, and why is that fair? Why do some people have access to this information? Do not. Source evaluation strategies. So the Project Information Literacy study did show that students are interested in this kind of thing. An example is lateral reading. This is something that has really taken hold in the past several years. As opposed to sort of evaluating a source based on what it is saying about itself by a checklist for things like currency, accuracy, etc. Lateral reading is a fact-checking move where it's a process that fact checkers use, where you're reading across sources. So you're trying to learn what is being said about a particular source from another source. So you're trying to gather information through more of a consensus on what has been said about this source. Questions around citation. So citation being about more than just following the rules of the university. It's also about lifting up people's voices. It's about giving credit where credit is due. And certainly and when we're talking about academia, there are questions around citation and grants and promotion and things like that. I'm not sure if you've heard of the citational justice movement, but that's an interesting one to think about as well. So there have been some studies that show that using name probability, we can determine that both women of color in particular, but also people of color and women are cited less often. And so that's an interesting thing to talk about with students and to think about, who are you citing, who is making it into your reference list. And then finally, is there any information perspectives that we're missing if we're focusing specifically on peer-reviewed literature? What exists outside of that, outside of those traditional structures that we use in academia? Big questions. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to Nicole now, and she'll talk to you about.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hello, everyone. Hello, Zoomers. My name is Nicole Marcoux. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. Like Laura said, I am new to DAL. I started in my position June 1st, and I'm currently an LTA, so I'm here until the end of May 2024. So like Laura said, if you'd like to work with me, please get in touch with me sooner rather than later, because there's an expiry date on my time with you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the STEM companion to the ACRL framework for information literacy. This was something that was approved by ACRL in 2022. So it contextualizes the 6 frames of the framework through a STEM lens. So we have where the readership for the companion is assumed to understand the framework, which now, thanks to Lindsay, we all do. So the idea behind the STEM companion is that science students are uniquely positioned to experience and practice information literacy through the context that we have like learning opportunities in. So really hands-on learning opportunities like labs and experiments, modeling, visualization, and things like that. So I'm going to go through the 6 frames like Lindsay did in a little bit more detail through the science lens, give a briefing of what the idea of each one is, and then talk a little bit about what they look like in practice based on the companion. So a reminder, these are not in any particular order. They are interrelated. They're in the same order that Lindsay posted or talked about hers, simply for ease of reference, but they're all interrelated and are sort of build upon each other in a non-linear way. So authority is constructed and contextual. So particularly in the sciences, we rely heavily on evidence-based research. But we need to remember and communicate to our students that authority in one subject does not equate to authority in all subjects or in all matters. So keeping the authority of a particular author or a particular group within the context of its knowledge. And that there's a growing understanding and sort of embracing the sciences that authority can exist beyond sort of our Western notions of peer-reviewed academic knowledge. So it can exist in community, it can exist in traditional and ancestral wisdom and knowledge. And those are also sources of authority in the sciences. So in practice, students who can sort of grasp this concept in STEM are able to understand the roles and limitations of authority in the sciences within and outside of Western constructs of authority as it relates to science. And they can also understand that markers of authority can shift over time and sort of adapt how they perceive and understand authority in science with those changes. Students are also able to critically evaluate published research for flaws, bias, and in particular, looking at sources of funding for the research as possible areas for conflict of interest. So those are just a few examples. The STEM companion, I will say, which is linked in our references slide, is 25 pages long. And it's a great read. I highly recommend digging into it. I just pulled a few that I thought were of particular interest. So information creation is a process. So information in the sciences have a sort of unique place in the research life cycle. We're creating unique information products, and they're happening at various stages of the research life cycle. So we have data sets, proofs, prototypes, technical specifications, guidelines. These are all information products that we're creating that are unique to the sciences. And peer-reviewed journals aren't the only source of valued information that we can find in the sciences. So in practice, students can understand that the choices of how scientific information is shared and communicated will impact how that information is used, who is able to use it, and the platforms in which it's shared conveys a message about sort of the values behind it. Students can also understand the value of peer-reviewed research and understand the value of other forms of sharing or circulating research, such as preprints, scientific information shared via social media. Of course, we are arming our students with critical eyes about who is sharing that information and where it's coming from, but understanding that a peer-reviewed paywall journal is not the only place that we can find authoritative scientific research. Information has value. Scientific information in particular is commodified greatly. An information literate student will understand that concept and understand that there are larger structures that impact how we do science, which research is embarked on, how it's embarked on, who gets to do science, who gets to do research, and the discourse around it generally. So in practice, students are able to understand that certain individuals, certain groups, for various reasons of marginalization, historical erasure, are not able to engage in scientific research or, as Lindsay mentioned, in the sort of citation justice movement, are not, their work isn't referenced as often. Students can understand the relationship between scientific literature and the ability to access scientific literature and the ability to undertake scientific research. Sorry, the background noise is challenging. Sorry. No, it's not your fault. I'm just easily distracted. It's not. And finally, students can understand that publishing decisions that we make as researchers impact who has the ability to access that scientific literature, and by proxy, whether or not those communities are able to engage in research, because the ability to access scientific research directly impacts the ability to engage in it themselves. And this important note, I didn't have this initially after this semicolon, but sort of the complexity of this issue is sort of further embellished by the fact that in academia, in most institutions, tenure and promotion decisions are still weighted very heavily on the perceived quality or authority of where our research is published. And so helping our students understand that it's not just that, oh, we search or we publish open access and I've solved the problem and everything's fine, that there are actually multifaceted complexities underlying those decisions, including the tenure and promotion of our faculty. Research is inquiry. So understanding that research mirrors the scientific process. It's iterative, it builds on itself. We're not necessarily finding solutions and closing a book and checking a box. We're answering questions, which are leading to more questions. So we're never not being curious. That's what research is. And that the related, the path to expert learning isn't about proving ourselves right or proving our research question right. It's about staying open to new possibilities and asking other questions as they emerge and remaining open to those. So in practice, students are able to understand that consensus within the scientific community is based on evidence that exists at a particular time and that can change over time. So similarly to markers of authority, that it's contextual, it's based in a particular time, and part of being inquisitive and curious about the research that we're doing is remaining open to where the evidence is leading us. Students are considering research as open-ended exploration. The STEM companion to the framework talks a lot about recapitulated knowledge, which is, I think, just a fancy way of saying like rote knowledge that they have to memorize in order to understand new things. So emphasizing that occasional emphasis on that sort of rote memorized foundational knowledge is the sort of framework that we give our students to have open inquiry into research. But that's not where the research begins and ends. So memorizing the facts, memorizing the sort of basics that they need to know is their starting point into inquisitive, curious research. It's not their end goal. And recognizing that as scientific researchers, we do have a responsibility to society as a whole about the questions that we're asking and the way that we're exploring them, because that scientific research impacts society as a whole, and understanding sort of where we fit as researchers in the broader spectrum of society and research. Scholarship as conversation. So scholarly conversations in the sciences are simultaneously very well ingrained, well established, sort of unmoving in some ways, and in flux. There are emerging paths of conversation, emerging narratives. So for example, we have peer review publications, which of course we consider the gold standard in many respects in academia. And those are happening alongside emerging practices like open peer review and peer preprint servers. So open peer review is a newer concept to me, but it's the practice of sharing the process of the peer review. So sharing what the feedback of the peer reviewers provided to the researchers and the changes that were made based on that feedback, which is interesting. So expert learners are able to understand the old systems and incorporate new practices into their sort of research methods. Excuse me. In practice, students are able to summarize changes in a particular scholarly perspective over time. So track that a conversation about a particular research topic started as this, and then with evidence, existing evidence, new research emerged, the conversation shifted in various ways, new conclusions were drawn, new questions were asked, it took us in a different direction. Understand that conversation requires debate and controversy. It's not always comfortable, but it is an important aspect of how we do research and find out new things. And critically consider disciplinary and systematic barriers to participation in scholarly conversation. So looking past, what does the paywall to an article represent? Our DAL students aren't paying directly out of pocket. They are through their tuition, but they're not paying $29.99 to access an article via ResearchGate because they have institutional access. And thinking a little bit, what are the next steps of that? What does it mean for people who don't have that institutional access? What does it mean that the research that they're accessing requires payment or institutional affiliation in order to access that? Searching as strategic exploration. So thorough expert searching of research requires using many search strategies across many different platforms. So Lindsay mentioned as part of Project information literacy, it was found that students tend to use their sort of favorite tried and true platforms and search strategies. This is encouraging our science students to take that a step further, particularly as the companion to the framework argues, STEM is becoming increasingly interdisciplinary, and so different searching and research strategies are becoming more and more necessary as sort of our disciplines are reaching into other pockets of research and other disciplines. So in practice, students are able to identify where the information is held and how to access it. They're able to navigate complex information systems and understand how information is organized with different access points. So for example, using different types of searching language. So we're using keywords, controlled vocabulary, technical terminology, the scientific jargon that they tend to avoid in the earlier part of their scientific research careers. And we're doing these across platforms. So, in an ideal world, they're looking in the scholarly databases, but they're looking in multiple different databases, multiple different platforms. They're looking at open source materials, and they're using a variety of strategies to access that information. I'll stand here. I'm just going to shuffle over.
I'm just jumping in for one slide to give Nicole a little break, but some of this information is probably going to be familiar to you, but we just wanted to offer some ideas, and Nicole's going to talk about what has happened in biology classes based on some of the literature she found. But there's always the opportunity to have a single, we affectionately call them one-shot session with a librarian in your class if you're interested in incorporating some information literacy. That librarian will be Nicole. So I'm offering her services. There's also the option for more ongoing support. So that might look like a few visits from a librarian. It could be that the librarian has access to your Brightspace and is answering questions on the discussion forum, something like that. So that really depends on what your needs and interest level is. So there's also the possibility, and I know that Laura has done a little bit of this, of integrating information literacy concepts into your course assignments as well yourself. And that is something that librarians can provide support on as well, to give you some ideas for how to build those types of assignments that do provide some guidance to students on how to do research rather than just asking for a particular word count, for example. Not saying any of you are doing that, I'm just the study suggests. So yeah, that's an option as well, would be to kind of revisit your assignments through an information literacy lens. It's useful to think about the framework as well, and particularly the STEM companion, because probably none of what Nicole said and what I said previously in the talking about the framework in general, you're all established, experienced researchers, so none of that was probably a surprise, but that's kind of the point of the framework, is that these are concepts that are not intuitive to students, and they need to be supported in being able to understand these things. So I guess thinking about what would a completely brand new researcher not know, and what can I support them in learning. I'm a little afraid to click on this because I don't want to, this is a link. Yeah, I don't want to disturb anything at this point in the presentation. So I'll just tell you what this is. So a LibGuide is that's our jargon inside their term for a research guide. So there's a research guide for every discipline that is taught at Dalhousie, and they're created by the liaison librarian for that area. So the biology research guide, LibGuide, is maintained by Nicole. It has her contact information on it. If I were to click on this, it would open a nice page with tabs listing key databases, key websites. I can't remember what all is on your guide.
You've got key journals.
Key journals, yeah. So information for students about how to get started with research in that discipline that is gathered together in one place. So add it to Brightspace or link it to your syllabus. And then even librarian contact information on your syllabus may be helpful to students, just to remind them that there is support available.
So from a literature search in preparation for our time together today, there are a few conclusions that have been drawn in and agreed upon in this sort of study of science students and information literacy. One of them is that there is a need for students to practice moving beyond sort of surface level markers of authority. So for example, I believe it's the second article there, Russo and Jankowski noted that I believe they did a survey of a full semester science information literacy course, which what a dream that would be. But they noted that one of the things that their students named as a practice that they had themselves in determining if an article was authoritative was the number of authors. So it wasn't even the affiliations of those authors or the journal that it had appeared in. It was, oh, this paper has 15 authors on it. It must be a reputable research article. An observation that I have made myself, which is not from the literature, but does sort of relate to this, is teaching our students in identifying types of scientific articles, is looking for introduction, methods, results, discussion, so IMRD, and many students will identify those elements as being present in the article and say, this is a primary research article. This is well done research because it has those sections, and then move on. So using those, sort of emphasizing to our students that these are indicators to dig deeper. There might be 15 authors on that paper. Where are they from? What research institution are they from? Is it even listed? There is an IMRD in that table of contents. This article is worth us digging a little bit deeper to see if it's a good fit for our project. So using those surface level markers as indicators to explore a little bit deeper. The digital native generation are very familiar and competent with technology. And there is an attitude sort of internally that they may believe that that equates to being good at evaluating information because they're good at using the tools to find that information. Studies have shown and agreed that that is not necessarily the case. Familiarity with technology does not equate to critical analysis skills, information evaluation skills, information literacy skills. So this is something I think probably many of us have seen in our classes with undergrads, and just to note that the literature agrees and validates that experience. So a few things that have been done, in particular in the biology classroom, to sort of emphasize and support information literacy for students. In relation to the sort of growing expectation that we have sort of in academics and I think society, that people generally, and our science students, especially our intro level science students, are able to discern credible from fake information. And we have this expectation of them without necessarily giving them the best tools to be able to develop those skills. So for example, this study by Thompson and Blankenship brought in paper copies of magazines, so Scientific American or even Time magazine with popular press articles, and scholarly journals. So they brought in Nature, Cell Biology, etc., and then had students in pairs examine one of each and determine what elements were present in each journal, look at the table of contents, look at the notes, the publication information, what type of language is used. Is it advanced and technical and jargony? Is it written more for a casual reader? Sort of encouraging students, asking questions for them to really discern what the purpose, what information is available in these different publications, who the audience is for, and what the goal of the publications are, because they're quite different. So really giving them like tangible tools and resources to compare and contrast the different types of scientific information that they would encounter. Another one, which this study came up a lot, the references on the reference slide, in my literature review of information literacy, because I think it was a very fun experiment where students were given little science kits, which had a plastic insect, which was very exciting. And then for the students, the article really emphasized that the plastic insects were crucial to the success of this activity. And so they were given the plastic insect and then a like brief like laminated sheet of the common name, the sort of Latin name. And then they were assigned this insect to look in, the library catalog, a scholarly database, and a reference work online. So the purpose of that was to find different information sources. So an ebook, a scholarly journal, and like an encyclopedia entry, and then determine what types of information did you find about your insect in each of these different information sources. Which was the most in-depth, which was the most current, in which one did you find out the average size or the average mating period, asking specific questions like that. And then the students would report back, oh, the encyclopedia told us all kinds of interesting information about their habitat range, but we didn't learn anything about, their breeding habits in 2023 with this, which is what this scholarly article that was about this very specific study that was run. So, the plastic insect as a sort of inroad to that type of information source evaluation was very successful in that respect. So we're going to move on to discussion. Are we taking this over? Or we can do it together? I don't know.
We can maybe both. So what time? How are we doing for time? We have like 15 minutes? Yeah. So this is kind of open. We can take questions, or if anybody has anything to say to speak to these. Heather?
Immediately, it's the ChatGPT.
Oh,
so yes, people are having access to academic publications. How do we train students knowing that this tool exists and can replicate work and can potentially be leading to more data justice? It can get behind paywalls that people can't if it's drawing from academic sources that would normally be limiting. How do we leverage this while also very carefully managing data literacy around this new tool?
It's an interesting question. My gut reaction would be my gut reaction would be to have them use it and think about things like, what was I able to actually track down this study? Like because that's actually something that's been a conversation in the library world is, I think they were calling it like ChatGPT hallucinations or something like that, where it comes up with what seems like a very good answer to a question. Yeah, it makes up citations. So I think that gives an opportunity for an interesting exercise, would be to try to track down the citations that show up in ChatGPT, and then maybe also reflect on, maybe it turns out that one author was real and the full citation wasn't. Maybe another citation they were able to find, and just kind of think about that through a critical lens, like how useful is this for this question, and in what ways, and maybe actually build in kind of a reflective assignment on it. Because it's here. We need to reckon with it. Yeah. Do you have anything to add?
I feel hesitant about adding this because I don't feel prepared enough to actually incorporate ChatGPT into my classroom sessions. But I would maybe add that, sort of like Google Scholar, where we know students are going to use the tool. We know they're going to use Google Scholar. Like at the library, we often talk about the smart ways to use Google Scholar because we know that they're going to use it. So rather than telling them not to, we encourage them to use it in the best way possible. Emphasizing the ways that ChatGPT or large language models can be useful to them. So large language models are great for brainstorming topics. Like they can't quite get their topic right. Have a kind of weird, bizarre conversation with an AI large language model to help clarify your topic or generate different ideas for what they want. That's something that ChatGPT is actually very useful for. It is not useful for generating academic sources of information.
Yes. I think the next iteration is actually behind the models, and that raises all interesting questions.
Potentially.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
have several questions. First, I'm going to totally steal that plastic insect activity, but I've already figured out how to modify it. But I guess I wanted to ask about when we're introducing students to research, and I'm always hesitant to monopolize librarians' time because I have many lab sections. So is it better to point them towards a LibGuide? Like, is there anything do we know how students are using them? Do we know how, like, do the instructors need to sort of say you have to use this, or do students, like, once they're pointed towards it, use it?
My experience has been that if it's introduced as a resource, some of them will say that sounds useful to me. If they don't know how to use the resources on the LibGuide, it's just going to be a bunch of noise.
Okay.
My experience has been when I do classroom sessions, where, for example, I'm instructing in how to search in Scopus, how to do database searching effectively, and demonstrating to them and talking about how it is a more effective use of their time than Google Scholar, and then emphasize that the LibGuides, if for no other reason, bookmark it because it's a list of databases and you won't have to go through the many steps of finding all the databases individually. That seems to pique their interest and sort of get them. I haven't looked at the stats specifically to see. I don't know if we can do that in the back end.
They're very minimal,
yeah.
The stats. Like they'll show how many people have looked at it, yeah. But they don't capture anything like the amount of time spent on it. And we can determine what links people are clicking on as well. That is something that we're able to tell, but it is quite limited.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So so students almost need even more support than like just being pointed towards library resources. They really need to be like, here's the assignment, here's the resources you can use, and here's other resources that like the librarians that you can also ask.
I would say so. Yeah, we love LibGuides at the libraries. They're very easy to build, and when they're done well, they're great and they're useful. But students don't know quite what they are, so I know I suggested put a link in your LibGuide, but I would say also at least kind of show them and maybe recommend some top databases, just as a way of sort of endorsing some of the content on the guide, because they do tend to have a lot of information on them. And that's something that we're always trying to work on, is information overload versus being too minimal. But yeah, some recommendation of here's the LibGuide, here are the databases I would personally recommend for this assignment, and the librarian's contact information is there as well. That's something that that's a service we provide. It's like one-on-one consultations with students, and also you, if you have questions about research or about information literacy in your class too. So you can direct students to the librarian if they have specific questions. Yes.
Can you tell me how long a typical little presentation that you would go through to demonstrate any of this would be? Because the time is always the killer.
Yes. My recommendation usually for a session that reviews like library, like a sort of intro year session of
we talk about second year.
Yes, no, of course, yeah, first or second year. Third or fourth year, the assumption is that they've at least interacted with articles regardless of how they found them. So introduction to library research, why is it important, talking about what databases are and how they can benefit you, a little bit of time for practice, and some reminders and recap is like a full 50-minute class.
Yeah, that would never been. So
well, like I think we probably all have a similar need at the second year, and so I'm almost wondering if we could have a video presentation that's perpetual, so that we can direct students to it, and maybe we do it periodically, so that it gives
the live guide up for years, and we always send students to it, but not very many use it. So even having a short, like 5 minutes, how to use the live guide, like what it shows you, would be really helpful, because they are very video. If I like the idea of a video, I don't think they would watch a 50-minute introduction to all research. I think that's too much. Because they're given an assignment, they know they have to find papers, so they know they have to look somewhere, and making it easy would be like something that they can watch quickly and okay, I can see how I can use this. Would that be possible?
I feel hesitant about creating videos in place of librarian sessions. I think the value, you might have additional thoughts as the learning and instruction librarian. I think my experience is that students are more engaged when there's a live person. They have a face, they have a point of contact. They remember the slide that I had a picture of my cats on, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's right. That like it sort of breaks up the noise. They're more likely to contact me. In my experience, I've worked, because I don't have a permanent position yet. I've been at a lot of different universities, and some libraries have policies or practices where the librarians do not share recordings of any instruction unless it's accompanied with an in-person visit. I don't know, it's not necessarily.
Could you do a 10-minute in a lecture?
Like I think there's certainly room for negotiation. I think any librarian introduction in a class is better than none. So definitely get in touch and we can talk about what the scope of that could look like.
I'm not a lecturer, so I have to.
Sure, of course, yeah.
But I actually take your point really well, because the same way that I value it, I feel it's important for my students to show up to lab. I think it's important for them to recognize librarians as a discipline that has value, and you wouldn't want to be reductionist in that way necessarily.
I think definitely better than video.
We stopped at hurricanes, we have more class.
Okay, Heather.
Dream big. Dream big.
If we wanted to introduce our students to citation justice and get them to look beyond, what would be the best route to introduce them as a topic? If they're very novice, like if they're still figuring out databases, if they're still figuring out who people are, how would you introduce that?
You know what? There is a short article in Nature, a short, very approachable article by Diana Kwan called The Rise of Citational Justice that is very readable, gives a really good introduction to it, including, it starts actually with the story of the Cite Black Women Collective, which emerged because a Black anthropologist in the US went to a conference and sat in on a session where she saw that one of her own pieces of work was being, it was on somebody's slide without a citation. And she realized that wasn't the first time that had happened to her. So the next time she showed up at a major conference, she had all these t-shirts that said Cite Black Women, and then it became a hashtag. And so the article begins there, and it's only about 5 pages long, and there's pictures and there's some references. So it's like very, you could assign it as a reading, even that's kind of an interesting way in. And then it talks about some of the studies and what they have found in terms of citation bias. And yeah.
I'm trying to find that article and I can't. The Rise of Citational Justice, Diana Kwan?
Yes. Kwan is spelled Kwon.
There we go. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's gonna go out.